Now it's time to test the spirit bomb. I've been waiting for this.
All I know is you came here because you knew all of Earth's living things had energy that you could steal. But you forgot one thing.
Oh? And what's that?
It also has energy to give.
Hey guys, it's Pud189 here, and I suggest you get comfortable for today's video. Maybe grab a drink or something. As the title suggests, today I'll be giving you a primer on the spirit bomb, or Genki Dama. Now, this would be the part where I tell you I'm used to calling it spirit bomb, and then I would use that and begin to talk about the technique, but that's not going to happen for a while. You see, spirit bomb is a pretty misleading name, and not a direct translation. Spirit ball, and no, I don't mean the Sokidan, is closer, but still fairly misleading. And usually I don't care if technique names are misleading because, they're just their names in the dub and I just enjoy them. And usually they sound pretty cool. But, today it's going to be kind of problematic. And we also can't really blame the translators here because even Genki Dama is not an entirely correct description of what the technique is, though I admit it's probably the best thing you could call it. The main problem is the word Genki and what it means, but even something as innocuous as Dama can mean various things. Dama roughly translates to ball, but it could also mean pearl, jewel, or jade, etc. But ball would suffice, really. However, let's get into the more problematic term of Genki. But before we do that, we need to start with the basics. First, we need to begin with the concept of ki, and it seems my Japanese lessons and my background in Eastern martial arts will pay off here. Ki, also called chi or ki with a Q, is, in basic terms, the energy in all living organic things. A rock would not have ki, but a dog would. A toaster or a computer or a book would not contain ki, but a man or a dog or a tree would. The concept of ki has been in traditional Chinese medicine and Eastern martial arts for thousands of years, and it's obviously extremely prevalent in Dragon Ball. The idea of controlling or manipulating ki, either physically or in a ranged form, has been in Dragon Ball nearly since the beginning. In fact, the idea of a ki blast is actually based in a theoretical technique in traditional Chinese martial arts, called the Qigong technique of empty force, meaning a master is so advanced that the ki inherent in his body can be manipulated to the point where he or she could pull it out of their body and use it without having to physically touch a target. Now, a ki blast, while based off of that, is not technically empty force, but that's where the idea came from. Though, interestingly, we do actually see a real usage of empty force in the series. Ten Shen'an actually uses it against the Cybermen, and he even uses the correct traditional hand gesture to do it. It's a little neat tidbit for martial arts nerds like me. Anyway, those are the basics of the idea of chi or ki. Now, for Genki. Genki is hard to really pin down as a word, as it's used in a lot of different connotations and meanings, but most of them are derived from a primary meaning. One of the most basic stock phrases you'll learn in a Japanese class is "O genki desu ka?" meaning "How are you?" And you can answer "Watashi wa genki desu" or just "Genki desu." That's you essentially saying "You are fine." And that's a very common modern way of using the word. However, that stems from another meaning of Genki, which is vigor or health. When someone says, "O genki desu ka?" and someone says, "Ah, genki desu," in other words, they're saying, "Are you healthy?" "Yeah, I feel healthy," or "I feel good." And the health aspect of it is just a step away from another, likely older meaning of Genki, which is a body's energy or even life force, in a certain sense. And it also could be seen as the origin of ki, which is obviously a life. And then there's even another step, which I believe is the oldest idea of it, which is the energy of heaven and earth, or the energy for all matter in the universe. And yes, Genki also can loosely be translated as spirit as well, though I don't think that meaning of the word really fits in the series well. Toriyama, however, does mention Genki and even spiritual energy in an interview, located in the Super Exciting Guide, or SEG for short. Toriyama says, "In battle, the most important thing is the size of your ki and your control over it. Ki as a concept, of course, includes such spiritual powers as energy, Genki, courage, Yuki, and right-mindedness, Shoki. No matter how much you train, there are limits to physical strength, and the only way to overcome that is through ki. I think Goku was able to approach the mightiest warriors in the universe through strengthening his ki." With that quote, we can see clearly that Toriyama thinks Genki is a subcategory of ki in his eyes, and that seems to coincide relatively well in his manga. Now, Yuki and Shoki aren't really mentioned much later, if at all, and honestly, you should always take Toriyama interviews with a pinch of salt, and from that it seems that while Genki is spiritual, it's spiritual in the sense of being a subcategory of ki, or ki is all spiritual. And if we look at techniques like the tri-beam, or kikoho, that harms one's own life force and can shorten longevity, as well as the interview and the aforementioned etymology of the words, we can make a few assumptions on the spirit bomb or Genki Dama. Ki looks to be the energy one has and that one could increase, whereas Genki, or one's life force, tends to be the subcategory of energy or ki that is central to keeping one alive or healthy. Imagine a body like a spaceship. Ki would be the energy that goes to moving the ship and using its various components, and Genki would be the energy used to keeping the engine and life support systems operational. And it appears that the energy that makes up your life force is more potent than your other ki. And if that's the case, it looks like Genki would be a dangerous thing to both use and lose. Now, it's notable to point out that more than a few times in the manga, characters refer to what the Genki Dama gathers as simply ki or chi. But remember that while not all ki is Genki, all Genki is ki. And so we can surmise that they are using ki and Genki interchangeably, as they can sometimes be considered synonymous. But let's go with that and really get into the technique itself. The Genki Dama, as we all know, was created by King Kai and taught to Goku. It's meant to be a technique only used as a last resort, as it has immense destructive power. But what does the technique actually do? Well, it gathers energy, firstly. Most notably, it seems to gather minute bits of Genki from all living things. Krillin explains to Piccolo on Namek that it utilizes energy from plants, animals, and even the smallest microorganisms. And as it gathers energy, specifically Genki as the name suggests, it must take a very small bit so as not to have adverse effects on the organism. However, it also seems that it has the potential to gather regular ki as well, as seen in the Buu saga, where Vegeta and Mr. Satan tell the people of Earth to raise their hands and give more energy willingly. If the technique was to gather more life force, or what we can surmise as Genki, it might affect their health, and so most likely it gathers normal ki, which would make sense, since the subject gets tired as if they just exercised when they raise their hands, rather than feeling ill or faint. But wait, there's more. Let's read a quote from King Kai for a second. King Kai says, "The Genki Dama is a technique that takes just a little bit of the various energies held by grass or trees, humans or animals, or even in objects and the atmosphere, gathers it all together and then fires it. Even the Genki Dama of such a small planet as this one had that much destructive power. The Earth where you'll be fighting is so large you can't even compare it to here. And if you're able to make the sun, with its gigantic energy, into your ally, it will be a Genki Dama with outrageous power. If you mess up, you could destroy the planet which you're supposed to protect." So apparently not only does the Spirit Bomb gather ki and Genki, but apparently also the scientific concept of energy, or at least thermal energy, if it can gather energy from the sun. But let's not also forget the most esoteric translation of Genki, being the energy from all matter in the universe. There looks to maybe be hints that the Genki Dama can even take energy from just matter. On Namek, when Goku is gathering energy for the technique, he complains that the main drawback of using it is the time it takes to gather ki. Yet the manga also states multiple times that he's gathering energy from other planets, using the term planet without mentioning organisms from the other planets. Goku says, "You planets close to Namek, give me just a little bit of your Genki," while Krillin says Goku must have even gathered ki from other surrounding planets. Now, I personally don't think it can take energy from just matter, as they mention ki of living things far more than the planets during the fight, but it was curious, so I figured I would mention it, and also for the fact that Genki can mean matter as well, or at least the stuff of the universe. But to reiterate, the technique itself seems to take Genki, regular ki, and energy from the sun or scientific or thermal energy sources if the user wants to, with the possible potential ability to just take energy from matter, but again, that's a stretch. Now, the energy of the technique also doesn't follow a linear pattern of growth. It seems that the energy that gathered within it causes the power of the technique to grow exponentially. Let's take the Spirit Bomb on Earth. During the first fight with Vegeta, Goku gathers the ki, and then he is ready to fire on Ozaru Vegeta. And if the power of Ozaru multiplied a Saiyan's power by 10, that means the power in Goku's technique had the capacity to defeat or heavily damage Vegeta with a power level of about, let's say, 160,000. I know 10 times 18,000 is 180,000, but Goku also says that Vegeta's power went down a bit when he summoned the false moon, so I gave a rough estimate on base Vegeta's power being around 16,000 then. And yet, when Goku gives the energy to Krillin later, he says half the energy of the bomb had left, and it still wasn't able to fully defeat a heavily damaged base form Vegeta. Now, let's go to Namek, where the power of several planets, with presumably less organisms than Earth, could give Frieza at 50% power a real scare. Let's say one can gather about 200,000 power level from Earth, and let's be generous and say that's the power that every planet has. Now let's say that there's 4 planets that Goku on Namek gathers that energy from. That technique, if we went by simple addition, would still not be able to beat second form Frieza, much less final form Frieza at 50% power. So my theory is that Genki, or Life Force, gathered together is an exponential and not linear improvement of power. That's the only explanation I can come up with when we take the statements into account, at least. Okay, now that we know roughly what the Spirit Bomb gathers, let's finally get past all these definitions and get to the meat of it. It looks like there are 2 versions of the Spirit Bomb, or Genki Dama. The most popular version of the technique is when the user stands with their feet at least shoulder width apart and their arms raised, their hands open and in the posture one might use if they're pushing against an invisible ceiling. The energy is gathered and appears above the user in a ball of light, ever increasing in size as they continue to gather the energy. Once it is complete, the user will then fling their arms down and launch the ball like a payload toward the intended target, almost like a catapult. Though there is a discrepancy or a contradiction in the manga. When Goku flings it at Frieza, it moves on its own accord with its own momentum. Yet when Goku throws it at Kid Buu, Goku needs to use his own power to push it. Perhaps Kid Buu was just strong enough to halt the momentum when Frieza just wasn't, and so Goku, while still in control of the ball, had to use some extra strength, but I want to note that a bit. Alright, the second version of the technique mostly follows the first, except this version gathers the energy within their dominant hand. It seems like this form of the technique is supposed to trade potential power for speed and accuracy. Goku uses this when he's training to use the Spirit Bomb on King Kai's planet, and he also utilizes this form when he's fighting Ozaru Vegeta. However, it looks like once the Spirit Bomb becomes too large and powerful, one can likely only use the first version where the massive ball of energy hangs over one's head. We also do need to note that if one ever loses the energy for the technique but manages to, quote, catch it, or give it to another, it will then appear like the ball of light in the more popular version, and consistently it's shown being controlled with one hand. You see this when Goku gives the energy to Krillin, and also when Goku loses and then gets the energy again in Dragon Ball Z Movie 2, World's Strongest. Though in Movie 3, Tree of Might, Goku gathers the energy and uses one hand without losing it to begin with, and then later he has the energy just inside of him ready to be used. Alright, sorry, I shouldn't include non-canon movies in what I try to keep purely a manga discussion, but sometimes I like to include just food for thought. Anyway, back to the technique. There also seems to be a prerequisite of sorts to being able to handle the technique that we're not really privy to. Obviously, it's a difficult technique to master, which is why Goku is the only character to use it. However, it seems even when the energy is gathered, controlling it is considered difficult. When Goku gave Krillin the Spirit Bomb to use, Goku explicitly states that it has to be Krillin, because Gohan could not handle such power. Now, it's difficult to tell if Gohan couldn't handle it because in his base power, without a rage boost, he's slightly weaker than Krillin, or because Gohan doesn't have the combat and training experience Krillin has. So it appears not just anyone can handle it, even if they don't even gather the energy beforehand. Also, I would be neglectful if I did not mention that Cell states he also could, quote, probably use the technique too. I'll be frank and say I personally don't believe that he can. I don't think he has the ability or knowledge to use either the Genki Dama or the Kaioken, or else he likely would have used Kaioken to great effect in the series. I see that as Cell simply being confident in his abilities, and also trying to intimidate Piccolo, Trunks, and Krillin, though I will note that Cell is the only main villain in Z that they don't attempt to use the Spirit Bomb on, likely because they don't want to find out if he can do it too. But again, in my opinion, I don't think he can use King Kai's techniques, but I had to mention Cell claimed he likely could. Now, for the final bit, let's discuss the effect of the technique. While the name Spirit Bomb is not a correct translation, the technique certainly acts like a bomb. It is unstable, dangerous, and it explodes violently. Hell, the Japanese name for the episode when Vegeta is struck by it is the Super Explosive Wave. When Vegeta is struck, he is sent hurtling into the atmosphere from the explosion of energy, and when Frieza is hit later on, he's thrown hurtling down into a crater that looks miles long, making a vast new lake on the planet's surface. King Kai himself warns Goku, as I stated earlier, that the Spirit Bomb should not be used unless absolutely necessary, because it can very easily destroy the entirety of any planet it's on. Oddly enough, the only time we don't see it explode is when it actually kills a final villain, being Kid Buu, though I do think that the reasoning for that is that the planet they are on is too small to detonate it, and the ball of energy simply continues onward into the void just without being detonated in general. That, and I think that Toriyama was taking a note out of his own playbook and having Kid Buu disintegrate into nothingness just like Cell when Cell was engulfed by Gohan's Kamehameha. Also, I want to note that it's hard to gauge if the Spirit Bomb actually has a set range. It seems like Goku can gather energy just from across the galaxy if he really wants to. It just takes that amount of time. But maybe there is a range to it. We're just never given that information. Okay, wow, that was a lot. I hope you guys enjoyed the video on the Spirit Bomb or Genki Dama. I want to quickly say that I am extremely overwhelmed by all the views and likes and the positive reception I've gotten to this channel after only a few videos. Thank you to everyone, and to everyone who likes and shares this video, and subscribes if they want to see what's next. Also, if you want to follow me on Twitter, there is a link in the description below. Alright, thanks guys, and have a great one.